I stood there, rifle in hand, as they laughed in my face. "What are you going to do with that? Throw it at us." My sergeant slapped it from my grip. The entire platoon erupted, but none of them knew what I'd done in those final 60 seconds before they arrived. None of them saw the recording. If you love stories of truth rising above lies, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because this story will shake you. My name is Thora Blackwell, and I need you to understand something right from the start. I didn't join the military to prove anyone wrong. I wasn't running from a broken home or chasing some Hollywood fantasy of what it means to serve. I joined because I wanted purpose. Real purpose. The kind that sits heavy in your chest and reminds you every morning why you opened your eyes. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree that felt meaningless, and I knew deep in my bones that I was meant for something more than a cubicle and a pension plan. So I signed up, and on the day I shipped out to basic training, my father, a veteran himself, a man who rarely showed emotion, looked me in the eyes and said, "Don't let them make you small, Thora. You're stronger than you think." I didn't understand what he meant then, but I would. Growing up, guns weren't mysterious or frightening objects in our house. They were tools, responsibilities. My father taught me to shoot when I was 13, out in the desert where the silence swallowed everything except the crack of the rifle and the ringing in your ears afterward. He taught me that shooting isn't about power, it's about discipline, patience, and respect. You don't pull a trigger carelessly. You breathe, you focus, you make the shot count. By the time I was 16, I could outshoot most of his veteran buddies at the range. They'd joke about it, ruffle my hair, tell my dad he'd raised a sniper. I never thought much of it. It was just something I was good at. But in the military, being good at something is supposed to matter. At least, that's what I thought. Basic training was brutal. But I thrived. I wasn't the fastest runner or the one who could do the most push-ups. But when it came time to qualify on the rifle range, I was near perfect 40 out of 40 targets. My drill sergeant raised an eyebrow, nodded once, and moved on. That nod meant more to me than any trophy ever could. I thought that excellence would be my shield, that if I just kept my head down and performed, I'd earn my place. I'd belong. But when I got assigned to my unit at the base, I realized very quickly that belonging wasn't about skill, it was about fitting into a system that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. My unit was led by Sergeant Dax Holbrook, a decorated 15-year veteran with a chest full of medals and an ego to match. He ran his platoon like a kingdom, and he had his knights, 3 men who'd served alongside him for years. Colt, loud and brash, always the first to crack a joke at someone else's expense. Ryland, quieter but meaner, the kind of guy who smiled while he twisted the knife. And Voss, the enforcer, built like a tank and just as subtle. Together, they were untouchable. They controlled the culture, the rhythm, the unspoken rules of who was in and who was out. And from day one, I was out. It started small. My gear would go missing. Nothing critical. Just enough to throw me off. My locker would be left open. My schedule conveniently forgotten during mission briefs. I'd show up for patrol assignments only to find out I'd been reassigned without notice. Dax's crew would brush past me in the hallways, muttering just loud enough for me to hear, "Try hard." "Teacher's pet." "Ice Queen." I never responded. I told myself that my work would speak louder than their insults. I told myself I didn't need their approval. But isolation has a way of creeping into your bones, and every day I felt a little colder, a little smaller. I reported nothing. I endured everything, and I kept shooting straight. Everything shifted the day we got assigned to the recon operation. It was supposed to be routine: gather intel, assess enemy movement in a contested zone, get out clean. 6 of us were selected: Dax, his 3 loyal soldiers, me, and a rookie named Piper Graves. Piper was barely 20 years old, fresh-faced and eager in a way that reminded me of myself before the base had worn me down. She had this nervous energy, constantly checking her gear, asking questions that the others rolled their eyes at. But I saw something in her that I recognized. She genuinely wanted to do this right. During the mission brief, while Dax was going over positions and protocols, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at me. The room went quiet. "Let's just hope Thora here doesn't freeze up out there," he said, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. "Wouldn't want those pretty little hands shaking on the trigger when it counts." The room erupted in laughter. Colt slapped the table. Ryland made some crude gesture. I felt my face burn, but I kept my expression neutral, my eyes fixed on the map in front of me. After the brief, as everyone filed out, Piper lingered behind and whispered to me, "Don't listen to him. You're the best shot here. Everyone knows it, even if they won't say it." Her words were a lifeline. I didn't know I needed. We deployed at dawn. The terrain was harsh, rocky, exposed, with barely enough cover to hide a shadow. I was assigned point position with Piper, which should have been an honor, but felt more like Dax setting me up to fail. He and his crew hung back, moving with the lazy confidence of men who believed they were invincible. I kept my focus sharp, scanning every ridge, every depression in the landscape. Piper stayed close to me, her breathing quick but controlled. "You good?" I asked her quietly. She nodded. "I'm good. Just stay close to you, right?" I gave her a small smile. "Yeah, stay close." Then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once. We'd walked straight into an ambush. 6 hostiles, entrenched and armed, had been waiting for us. Piper screamed. I saw her stumble, saw the blood bloom across her shoulder as she went down hard. Everything slowed and sped up at the same time I heard Dax shouting, "Contact! Fall back! Fall back!" But his voice sounded a million miles away. I didn't think. I just moved. I ran toward Piper while bullets tore up the ground around me. The air hissing with near misses, I grabbed her by her vest and dragged her behind a crumbled stone wall. My muscles screaming with the effort. She was gasping, crying, her hand pressed uselessly against the wound. "I've got you," I told her, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've got you, Piper. Stay with me." I returned fire. 1 shot, 2, 3, 4 hostiles down in rapid succession. My training took over completely. Breathe, aim, fire, breathe. But I was counting rounds in my head, and the math was brutal. 12 rounds left 6 enemies. Piper bleeding out beside me. And over the comms, Dax's voice kept screaming the same thing. "Fall back! That's an order! Fall back now!" I looked at Piper. Her eyes were wide, terrified, searching mine for reassurance I wasn't sure I could give. She would die if I left her. I knew that with absolute certainty, so I made a choice that would define everything that came after. I stayed, I ignored the order, and I fought like my life, and hers, depended on it, because they did. When we finally made it back to base, I was running on pure adrenaline and something that felt like borrowed time. Piper was unconscious but stable, rushed immediately to the medbay with medics swarming around her gurney. My uniform was stained with her blood and dirt, my hands still shaking from the tourniquet I'd tied with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling I'd used every single round. My rifle was empty, but Piper was alive. That was all that mattered to me in that moment. I thought, God, I actually thought that maybe this would be the thing that changed everything. That saving a life under fire would prove I belonged. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. The debriefing happened 2 hours later. I sat in that sterile room under fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and unreal, and I told them exactly what happened. The ambush. The impossible math of bullets versus enemies. My decision to stay with Piper instead of retreating. The 4 confirmed kills, running out of ammunition while keeping her alive. I spoke clearly, factually, the way I'd been trained to report. But Dax was sitting across from me, and I watched his jaw tighten with every word I said. When it was his turn to speak, he told a completely different story. According to him, I had panicked. I had frozen under pressure. I had wasted ammunition firing wildly at shadows, and then I'd abandoned my position, leaving the team vulnerable. "She came back with an empty rifle," he said, his voice cold and authoritative, the voice of a man who'd never been questioned. What kind of soldier runs out of ammunition in a firefight? Either she can't shoot, or she's a coward, maybe both. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the senior officer held up a hand. "We'll review the incident thoroughly, Specialist Blackwell. Dismissed." I left that room feeling like I'd swallowed glass. But the real nightmare didn't start until the next morning. I walked into the mess hall for breakfast, and the moment I stepped through those doors, I felt it, the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward me, the ripple of whispers and barely suppressed laughter. Dax was standing in the center of the room, and he was holding my rifle above his head like a trophy. "Gather round, people," he announced, his voice booming. "I want to show you all what failure looks like." My stomach dropped. I stood frozen near the entrance, unable to move, unable to breathe. "This," he continued, shaking my rifle, "is an empty weapon. Thora here wants us all to believe she's some kind of hero, that she saved Private Graves. But heroes don't come back empty-handed. Heroes don't run out of bullets because they don't know how to count or aim." The room erupted. Colt's voice cut through the noise. "Maybe she should carry a slingshot next time, or a pointed stick." Someone threw a piece of fruit. It hit the wall near my head. Ryland was laughing so hard he was doubled over, and then Dax walked toward me, slow and deliberate, his boots echoing on the tile floor. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could smell the coffee on his breath, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a predator's smile. Then he slapped the rifle out of my hands. It clattered to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. "Pick it up, Blackwell," he said quietly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and don't ever let it go empty again." 40 people watched me bend down and pick up that rifle. Not one of them said a word in my defense 1 week. That's how long I lived in that suffocating silence, where every conversation stopped when I entered a room, where every glance felt like a judgment I couldn't appeal. Piper was still recovering in the medbay, and I wasn't allowed to visit her. Some excuse about limiting exposure during the investigation. Because yes, there was an investigation. Not into Dax's account of what happened. Not into why a decorated sergeant would publicly humiliate a subordinate. No, the investigation was into me. Into my reckless engagement with enemy forces and gross ammunition mismanagement. I had to sit through interviews where officers who'd never seen combat asked me why I didn't retreat when ordered, why I didn't conserve ammunition, why I made the choices I made, and every time I explained, I could see the doubt in their eyes. They'd already decided what kind of soldier I was, and nothing I said was going to change that I barely slept. I barely ate. I kept replaying that moment in the mess hall over and over, the sound of my rifle hitting the floor, the laughter that followed me like a shadow. I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I had panicked. Maybe I had made the wrong calls. Doubt is a poison that works slowly, and I could feel it spreading through me, making me question everything I knew to be true, but then everything changed in a single afternoon. Lieutenant Cressida Vale was the senior officer assigned to review the incident. She was known for being thorough, unflinching, and impossible to manipulate. She didn't smile much, didn't engage in small talk, and had a reputation for ending careers when she found misconduct. When I heard she'd taken personal interest in my case, I didn't know whether to feel hopeful or terrified. 3 days into her review, she called an emergency assembly. Every member of our unit was required to attend. No exceptions. We gathered in the briefing hall, the same room where Dax had given countless mission briefs, where his authority had never been questioned. The energy was strange. People were confused, whispering to each other, trying to figure out what was happening. Dax sat in the front row with Colt, Ryland, and Voss, looking irritated but unconcerned. I stood in the back, trying to make myself invisible. Lieutenant Vale walked to the front of the room carrying a tablet. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Body cameras," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Every soldier in the field wears one. They record everything. Video, audio, timestamps. We use them for training, for accountability, for evidence, and in this case, to uncover the truth." My heart started pounding. I'd completely forgotten about the body cam. In the chaos and aftermath, it hadn't even crossed my mind. "What you're about to see," Vale continued, "is footage from Specialist Blackwell's camera during the engagement in question. I want absolute silence." She pressed play, and the large screen behind her flickered to life. And then they saw everything. They saw me dragging Piper to cover while bullets chewed up the ground around us. They heard my voice, steady despite the chaos. "I've got you, stay with me, Piper. Stay with me." They watched me take down 4 hostiles with 4 precise shots, each one deliberate, controlled, exactly as I'd been trained. They saw my ammunition counter dropping, 10 rounds, 8, 6, 4. They heard Dax's voice over the comms, distant and crackling. "Fall back! Leave her, that's an order!" And they watched me refuse. They watched me use my final 2 rounds to suppress the remaining enemies while I worked frantically to stop Piper's bleeding. My hands slick with blood as I tied the tourniquet. They saw me shield her body with my own. When the recording ended, the silence in that room was absolute. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from shame. Deep, collective, undeniable shame. I could see it on their faces, the way people couldn't meet each other's eyes, the way hands fidgeted with uniforms and chairs scraped against the floor as bodies shifted uncomfortably. Lieutenant Vale stood at the front, her expression unreadable, letting that silence do its work. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, I heard movement. Piper stood up. Her arm was still in a sling, her face pale but determined. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and when she spoke, her voice cracked but carried through the entire room. "She saved my life," Piper said, and every head turned toward her. "Thora saved my life. I was dying. I felt myself dying, and she stayed. She could have run. She could have followed orders and saved herself. But she stayed with me, and she fought for me, and now I'm standing here because of her, and you all laughed at her." Her voice broke completely on that last word, and she sat back down, covering her face with her good hand. I looked at Dax. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked small. His face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. Colt and Ryland were staring at the floor. Voss had his arms crossed, but his expression was haunted. They knew. Everyone knew. Lieutenant Vale finally spoke, her voice like steel. "Sergeant Holbrook, you filed a false report. You publicly humiliated a soldier who acted with extraordinary courage and skill. You prioritized your ego over the truth and nearly destroyed a career in the process. You will be removed from command immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct and leadership. If I find evidence of a pattern of behavior, and I suspect I will, you'll face a court-martial." Dax opened his mouth to protest, but Vale cut him off with a single look. Then she turned to me. "Specialist Blackwell, you acted with honor, precision, and selfless courage under the most extreme circumstances. You made the hardest choice a soldier can make, and you made it without hesitation. This base, this unit, and this country owe you an apology and our gratitude. You will be awarded a commendation for valor, effective immediately." The aftermath unfolded quickly. Dax was stripped of his command within 48 hours and reassigned to a desk job on the other side of the country. 6 months later, he was quietly discharged. Colt, Ryland, and Voss all faced formal reprimands that went into their permanent records. The unit culture shifted almost overnight. Not perfectly, not magically, but enough that I could breathe again. People started looking me in the eye, saying good morning, asking my opinion during briefs. I earned something I'd never had before, genuine respect, not because I demanded it, but because I'd proven what I was made of when everything was on the line. Piper and I became inseparable. She calls me her guardian angel, but I tell her she saved me too. Her courage to stand up in that room when no one else would gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. My dignity. My voice. We're still serving together, still watching each other's backs, and I still carry that same rifle. Sometimes I check it out of habit, making sure it's loaded, but I've learned something that no training manual could ever teach me. It's not about how many bullets you have. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice when you run out. Some battles aren't won with ammunition. They're won with courage, truth, and refusing to abandon what matters most, even when the whole world is telling you to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the truth always comes out, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me, have you ever been doubted, only to prove them all wrong? I'll be reading every single one. They mocked me for carrying an empty rifle, but they never asked why it was empty. And when they finally saw the recording, they understood. Some battles aren't won with bullets, they're won with courage.